Sprue on the other side of the campus. And I'm also a member of the STEP Centre, which is one of the recent and ongoing collaborations between Sprue and the Institute of Development Studies. Today we're going to hear about some of the earlier collaborations in that vein from Geoff Oldham. Geoff was director of Sprue from 1982 to 1993, and amongst other things has been chairman of the United Nations Advisory Committee on Science and Technology for Development and the UN delegate to the UN Commission on the UK delegate to the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development. Geoff is going to be talking to us primarily about a report which has come to be known as the Sussex Manifesto. Just to give you some historical context, this came out 4 years after the initiation of both Sprue and IDS, and on a personal note, it also came out 6 years before the initiation of my life. Thanks. Let's all welcome Geoff.
I'm not quite sure with all of this material here whether I should sit or stand, but I'll try standing to begin with anyway. Well, thank you very much, Adrian. I must say it's great to be back here and back in this particular room. I've been here many times before, so a good few decades ago. But when Adrian asked me 2 or 3 months ago to give this presentation, he was keen that I tell a story. I tell the story about the Sussex Manifesto rather than go into great detail about its contents. He particularly wanted me to address the early history. What were the relationships between Sprue and the IDS like at the time that we got together a team, became known as the Sussex Group, to prepare this so-called manifesto? And then to describe a little bit about the process of preparing the report, to perhaps give a few of my own personal comments about its highlights and its shortcomings, to say something about its impact. Did it really change things anywhere in the world as a result of its preparation? Finally, to perhaps address a little bit about, well, if we were writing the report today, how different would it be? What are the new issues which have come to our attention, or in fact have come about since the report was prepared in 1969. It was actually published in 1970. So that's what I'm proposing to do. And I should say right at the beginning that this is purely my reflections on what happened. I haven't gone back to original minutes of meetings or anything. It's not a historical account. And I'm sure other people who would have been participating in these events may have very much a different perception of what happened. But if you can just bear that in mind and not hold me to the fact that I was out by several months on one thing or another. So that's what I'm proposing to do. Now, I'm going to miss that one, but I can't make it go.
There's a time lag.
Okay. What were the early things which ultimately led to the relationships which existed at the time between the IDS and Sprue? Well, as you will all know in this room, both Sprue and the IDS were started in the same year, 1966. But the origins of each of these two organizations were totally different. The IDS was created by the UK government through the Overseas Development Administration with a block grant. It happened that the IDS was located at the University of Sussex after quite an intense competition between several British universities, whereas Sprue was started with just simply 2 academic posts and an administrative post. Chris and myself and Jackie Fuller, who is here this afternoon. our task, our job was to not allocate money, because the first task for the IDS was to say, well, we have this large sum of money, how do we allocate it to achieve our objectives? SPRU had to accrete money in order to bring people on board, in order to develop a program and ultimately a teaching program as well. So the first thing was, how did the IDS go about allocating this block grant? They had decided that in the first instance there would be 10 senior appointments, 10 fellows appointed, and I remember attending a meeting of what was called the Board of Studies. I don't think it exists anymore, but there was something called the Board of Studies which met to decide on internal IDS priorities. And there was Patrick Blackett, who was the Nobel Prize winner in physics, who played an active role in encouraging the development of the IDS. He was an advisor to Harold Wilson. And he and I made the case at one of these meetings why some of this block grant, at least one we were arguing for, of the posts should go to science and technology. Other people were saying, no, we needed 3 or 4 economists and political scientists also, and we need some people who can work on Africa and others on South Asia. There was a big debate, and everybody was putting forward their views as to what should be this allocation of posts. At the end of the day, the decision was made by the governing board of the IDS that a half of one post would go for science and technology. But that was quite a victory at the time. We had got the governing board of the IDS at one of its very first meetings to recognize that science and technology were important aspects of development, and this new institute should embrace it. In a small way, but it should embrace science and technology. But there was a caveat, and the caveat was that SPRU had to find the other half post. We had no money to allocate something from a block grant or from the university. We had to try and find the money. And we were ultimately successful by getting a grant from the Ford Foundation, which at the time was quite a large grant. It was stretched over 5 years. And from that, we were able to match the IDS and have another half post so that there could be a joint fellow on science, technology and development. And that joint fellow was Charles Cooper, who many of you will remember, I'm sure. But out of that money too from the Ford Foundation, we were able to finance a project which Martin Bell undertook in Thailand, and also had 1.4 researchers working on science, technology and innovation in China. At that time it was a traditional China watching exercise. Just watch the time and make sure I don't go too long on this part of it. So we got the funding, we got a half post. I point out that there were also SPRU IDS interactions which led to our being involved in the design of the IDRC, and ultimately in SPRU being asked to really run and develop the Science and Technology Policy Program of IDRC. And in fact, 4 SPRU researchers at different times were involved as program officers for the IDRC. There was Martin, Andrew Barnett, Alison Warhurst and myself. And that has all kinds of implications for the way certainly SPRU developed. But if I went into that, I'd be another half hour, so I won't. I will go on just to mention that one of the very first IDS workshops was a joint one with SPRU on science and technology. And this were about 70 or 80 people from outside the university, from industry, from government departments, from Tropical Products Institute and so on, to get their views on what were the issues which warranted research, both by the IDS and by SPRU in this field of science and development. Out of that workshop came ultimately funding from ODA for a project on the scientific instruments industry in India. And although this was originally to be a joint project, in fact, for administrative reasons, it was carried out entirely by SPRU, and this led to Norman Clark joining the team. I have to mention the IDS SPRU study seminars, because these, to my mind, were one of the most important cooperative ventures that took place between SPRU and IDS in these early years. Study seminars were 3-week seminars on development topics for about 30 or so people from the developing world, each one of these. And the ones which we held on science and technology were just very exciting events. And I still get thank you letters, even this Christmas, a Christmas message of thanks from a former minister in Argentina who was president of the Bank of Buenos Aires after he had participated in the study seminar at Sussex. But anyway, all I want really to do in this part of the presentation is to indicate there was a lot of interaction between SPRU and the IDS. It was fluid, it wasn't really formalized, but it was close and it was productive. So that there was a milieu, as it were, for when Hans Singer finally arrived at the IDS and brought with him the possibility of a project to prepare the introductory chapter to what was being called the World Plan of Action on Science and Development, which the UN were preparing. That we were readily able to put together a joint SPRU-IDS team. That's the background. When we come to the next slide, the preparation of the manifesto, there were 6 members of the Sussex group. Hans Singer was the chair. Charles Cooper was the secretary of the group. Then there was Chris Freeman, and a visiting fellow in SPRU who was a sociologist of science from Australia, and Oscar Gish, who was at that time, I think, doing a PhD at the IDS. The terms of reference are important to realize that what we were given as a very specific task by the Office of Science and Technology in the UN was to prepare this introductory chapter for what they would then be publishing as the World Plan of Action on Science and Development. But it was to be an overview of the issues, what diagnostic, if you like, of the problems of science, technology and development. And some effort to indicate what the solutions to these problems might be. And since what the UN Advisory Committee was going to be doing was not only to have this draft chapter, but they were going to use our report as a contribution of the committee into the second development decade. The UN had development decades at that time. I'm not sure they do now, but they did then. And this was the second one for the decade of the 1970s. And so we were given the opportunity of looking forward 10 years to see how the problems which we'd identified in our report might be addressed and solved. And we made some fairly, it was considered at the time anyway, quite radical suggestions of what needed to be done. The process was fairly straightforward. We met, I think, as a group 3 or 4 times. Each time we met, somebody from the UN Secretariat in New York came over to make sure we were doing what they thought was needed. And eventually a report was produced. I think, I say, we met about 4 times. It went over about a 6-month period. Each of us drafted different parts of the report, and Charles had the task of knitting it all together and making it seem coherent. But anyway, that's what it was. It was then sent off. And Chris and myself were then invited by the advisory committee. They wanted a scientist and an economist, and Chris and I were invited. The committee was meeting in Addis Ababa on a whole range of issues, only one of which was our report as the introductory chapter. A date was set when Chris and I should arrive to make the presentation, and we travelled to Addis, only to be met and told that unfortunately they'd had to move that agenda item up by 2 days. They'd already discussed the report and it had been rejected. I'm very sorry, but we could go home. We insisted that out of any sense of decency, at least we should be given the chance of making our presentation to the committee. Rather reluctantly they agreed, and so the following day we made the presentation. But they said, you're not going to influence our decision. We've already decided that it is not appropriate for our needs for the introductory chapter to the World Plan of Action. So at the end of our presentation, Chris and I, and we'd thought about this ahead, said, well, we trusted that they would allow us to go ahead and publish it because we thought there was some important stuff in it. They came back almost immediately and said, no, it is our property. We paid for you to prepare that report. It is now ours. It is not yours to publish, and we don't want you to publish it. Well, Chris and I then had a quick chat, and we came back with the riposte. Well, we were very sorry, but we thought it was important that the world debate these issues far more than they have before. We were going to go ahead and publish it, and we challenged the United Nations to sue Sussex University, because this would give great visibility to the report. It threw, I must say, it threw the whole meeting into total confusion. The chair of the meeting closed the session and said they would go into closed session, so all the observers from all the UN agencies and Chris and myself had to leave. We took the opportunity and went bird watching, because you know Chris is a great bird watcher in the Rift Valley, so he was not at all unhappy. But when we got back, we found that they had come up with a solution, and the solution was to write their own introductory chapter, but to come up with a separate publication. This is it, I still have a copy. A separate publication where they would print their version of the introductory chapter, and then as an appendix they would have the full version of our report. We were happy with this and came back. The next thing was the presentation of the report, particularly the report of the advisory committee, to the people who were planning the second development decade. This became a very heated meeting, we understand, because we were not there, but we heard about it, and that at the end of the day, it was debated in the General Assembly, and our report was considered radical, quite political, and therefore, well, that's where it got the title, the Sussex Manifesto. It was in the records of the General Assembly debate. Someone had referred to this as the Sussex Manifesto. And of course it was a title that stuck. And everybody has called it Sussex Manifesto ever since. Although, to be perfectly honest, I thought it had been dead and buried. I hadn't thought about it for well over 35 years until Adrian and Andy and Melissa talked about it. I then discovered, actually, when I read Richard Jolly's obituary to Hans Singer, and that obituary refers to Hans's view that this is one of the most important documents that he'd been involved in writing. And I wished I'd had a conversation with Hans before he died to find out why he considered it was so important, and whether or not perhaps he had been involved in its dissemination later on. But that was the background. Now, in hindsight, what did we do well? Well, this is a few things after reading through the report again a few weeks ago that I decided that I was really quite pleased that we had addressed these issues well. The first, I think, we demonstrated that this whole issue of scientific research, building scientific and technical capabilities, technology transfer, and the demand from society and from the economic system for science and technology, we demonstrated in a way that I don't think have been done before, all the things are interconnected. It's a system. And if you just only focus on one aspect of that system and try and solve that, things won't change. And we demonstrated this interconnectedness, and I think that was a plus. We were asked to focus mainly on science and technology and economic development. That was part of our terms of reference. And I think it was done well. It was done well in the state of knowledge at that time. And the fact that the 6 members of the Sussex Group team had very different backgrounds, had different educational and sort of field experiences, and bringing it together, it gelled as a group. We built on one another's ideas, and it came up with, I think, something which was in advance of what the general literature was at the time. It was meant to be a synthesis, but it was a synthesis not only of the literature, but of a lot, well, our 6 of us, individual experiences. It showed, and this I think was another big plus, it showed the need to consider the demand for science and technology as well as the supply. Most of the previous work at that time had focused on the research needs, the need to build up S&T capabilities across the board, and the technology transfer side. But we demonstrated, I think, very clearly in the report that unless there was a demand in society, in the developing countries' economic systems, for new technologies, for inputs from the S&T system, then all the supply in the world wasn't going to have much impact on development, certainly. Also, when we looked at the whole science and technology system, we made a strong point about the fact that it wasn't just the R&D system. Most reports up till this time had focused almost exclusively, if you're building an indigenous scientific and technical capability in the developing world, it's the research system which needs to be stressed. We concluded that that fact was in large measure due to the fact that R&D is fairly easy to measure, and therefore people are comfortable about working about in the R&D system. All the other scientific and technical activities are much more difficult to measure, and hence tended to be neglected. Or we didn't neglect them. We made strong points about the fact that we not only needed to include what was called in the Frascati manual scientific and technical support, STS, scientific and technical support, but go beyond that, and we identified the need to consider what was happening in the private sector with engineers, design engineering, and also the whole education system also had a need for scientific and technical inputs. Another thing we did well, and I'll come back to this in a moment or two, was the issue of the development of indicators on science and technology and targets for the second development decade. Well, what were our shortcomings? What didn't we do so well? I think we could have given much greater prominence to social and environmental issues. We mention them, but we don't give them the prominence I would nowadays have given them. Strangely, there's no mention of the word innovation in that report, either radical or incremental. And that is strange because at the same time, we were drafting the Act, creating the IDRC in Canada, and we put in the fact that an objective of the IDRC was to develop the innovation skills in developing countries, not just support their research system. We ignored totally the implicit science and technology policies which are inherent in any government's economic or fiscal or other areas of policy making. what determines how entrepreneurs or industrialists or farmers react? What is it that drives them as they make decisions about technological choice? It's often such things as getting tax benefits if they invest in R&D. And those are not usually embedded in science and technology policies. We came close, in my view, rereading that, to realizing this importance of the implicit science and technology policies, but it was really an IDRC project, the Science and Technology Policy Instruments project, which came a few years later, which really made that explicit. I think the ethical issues should have had greater prominence, and we again totally ignored the gender dimension of S&T. And all of these things were things which, in hindsight, we should have recognized, because they weren't unknown. But we didn't do them justice. Now, the next point I had was this issue of indicators. I'm going to have to be very brief on it, but it was an important part of our work. We've been asked to address indicators and to think about targets. What might happen over a 10-year period of the second development decade? We recognized as one of our priorities in the report that what was needed above all else was to develop an indigenous scientific and technical capability throughout the developing world. At that time, in '69, the average for developing countries to be spending on R&D was about 2.2% of GMP. And we, if we were going to strengthen the research system, and remind you that this is something that you can measure, we thought what was the maximum rate at which a fairly small research system in most developing countries could be expanded. Where were the human resources going to come from, and so on. And we reckoned that at the end of 10 years, about the maximum you could expect to be spent on R&D, if that was a real goal, was to build up the indigenous S&T system, was 0.5% of GMP. And we felt that this SDS would have to grow not only in a commensurate way, but probably to several times that amount of money. If the research was going to be used and used in production, and there was to be then going to be a demand on the R&D system. We also addressed the issue of how could the developed world assist the developing world in building up its indigenous scientific and technical system. And again, we had reasons for suggesting this figure, which I won't go into, but we came to the view that within the 10 years, 5% of all aid should go to be on science aid, and it should be helping build up the indigenous capabilities. We also addressed the question of how to reorient all of the massive research that's going on in the developed world, and we came up with the view that within 10 years, 5%, instead of the 1% that the OECD figures indicated in 1970, 5% should be oriented, usually in collaborative projects, we were suggesting, on the problems of science and development. This was to be 5% of non-military R&D, where we were focusing on. One other indicator which we had, which came, I think, from Charles, I seem to remember looking at OECD data, was the fact that the division between R&D spending in the non-command economies, advanced countries of the world, and that in the developing world, the statistic at that time showed it was a 98% all R&D done in the north, 2% in the south. We argued that that should, within 10 years, that 5% of total R&D should be in the south. But, and there's a big but in this, what I found subsequently to all of this is that there's little point in suggesting indicators and targets when it's extremely difficult to measure those indicators. And for example, it has proven pretty well impossible to measure how much of any country's aid program goes on science and technology, or even in R&D. And I've been involved with 2 efforts to try and do that, one with IDRC and one with the UN Commission. So it's just something to be aware of. I will go through a little more quickly on the impact issue. This is what, again, Adrian asked me to address. First of all, we must recognize that it's impossible to measure overall impact of a report like this, even if it did get quite a lot of publicity because of the fact that it was put into the planning phase of the second development decade. It did raise the awareness of the role of science and technology in some UN circles. And again, you have to remember that at that time, there was a genuine hostility on the part of many economic planners around the world, both developed and developing countries, on any increased expenditures on science and technology. Most economists believed that any technology which was required in the South could be acquired from the North. But it did increase, to some extent, the appreciation of science and technology in UN circles. I think the biggest impact probably was on the Sussex group itself. It was a great experience to be a part of that group. I'm sure we all benefited from it. My own horizons were certainly widened a great deal by hearing Hans Singer and Chris and Charles and the others debate the issues. And I think each of them, were they here today, would have said the same thing. It did actually have quite a considerable impact on the design of the IDRC, which was going on at about the same time. I know Maurice Strong, who was the president of the Canadian Aid Agency at the time and the main father of the IDRC, used this 98% research in the developed world, 2% in the developing world, in many of his speeches, which allowed the political climate in Ottawa to be receptive to the idea of this new research organization. I won't go into the approach document for Indian science policy. Hans Singer apparently regarded the report as one of the most important he'd been involved in writing. The report was used for teaching courses in universities in both North and South. I went to the web and looked for any references to the Sussex Manifesto fairly recently and found reports that the university in Dar es Salaam had used it as one of their materials. But it also had a negative impact. And this is something I want you all really to reflect on. When the advisory committee presented their report and our annex to the people planning the second development decade, both reports, both ours and the advisory committees, were rejected on the grounds that we had developed these targets. So I've just been describing the indicators and targets, and that it wasn't appropriate for an academic group or a scientific advisory committee to put forward targets. That, they said, is a political responsibility, and therefore it was inappropriate for us to have put them forward. And they rejected the whole effort because of that fact. And the danger of being involved in setting targets over the future is something I've been very wary about in my career ever since. But all right, now, just quickly now, really, to this. If we were preparing the report today, what new issues have occurred really since 1970, which we would have to take into account? And I'm hoping that you're going to get involved in a debate and a discussion about that. I just put 5 up there, just at the top of my head. Globalization. I think we would give greater attention to science and technology for tackling issues of poverty today than we did then. Actually, more attention to market economies. We were very much influenced at that time by the development planning, economic planning paradigm. It was foremost at that time, and quite a bit of our work today in that report does look a little old hat, because we were claiming so much of what would be the role of governments instead of the market. But if you think of what's happened in China, Vietnam, and all of these centrally planned economies at that time, they were all moved to market economies. The growth of scientific and technical capabilities in China, India, Brazil, and so on, totally different from what it was when we did the report. And the impact of new technologies. These were not on the horizon. We did talk about the impact of the development of synthetics. So that was sort of the equivalent of the impact of new technologies. Well, finally, some general conclusions, in part based on the Sussex Manifesto, in part based on my experience with other projects of a similar nature. When I say a similar nature, a part of that activity is diagnostic. It's meant to try and understand what's going on, to identify the problems, but it then also has a prescriptive dimension. And as was suggested, a political dimension, but certainly a prescriptive dimension. What I have found is that reports have the greatest impact when there's an audience or an event to which the report can be directed. There should be an audience. There should be people who could do something about it when they receive the report, rather than just publishing it as a paper in the literature. I think it's a useful objective in any of these exercises to build an esprit de corps amongst the group members, to build on their different strengths and of the institutions to which they're a part. I think it's important to be optimistic about the future. We were very optimistic in that Sussex Manifesto. We felt that things could be changed, and we made some prescriptions of how to do it. In point of fact, they weren't accepted, so perhaps I should be pessimistic, but I always come back to Chris's Economics of Hope. I don't know if you haven't already, you should, because this is a collection of Chris Freeman's essays that he wrote about the economics when you take an optimistic or a hopeful stance. I think you should plan and budget for dissemination, and perhaps think big about this and think of how you can get your hooks into the different political systems and organizations so that action can follow. But to end up by encouraging everyone to be aware of the potential conflict between academic analysis and advocacy. Both are necessary if those of us in the academic world are going to really have an impact on society, I believe. Not everyone would agree with that. But if I could just mention one other report that I was involved in where this was really brought home to me. I've been involved working with what's called the Gender Working Group of the UN Commission. We were 8 men and 8 women. We worked for an 18-month period, 4 meetings, and came up with a diagnosis of the issues to do with gender and science and development. And we came up with some prescriptions of how the problems we'd identified had been overcome in some countries, but how they might be overcome in many more. We had a prescriptive dimension to it. We had a first draft of this report, and we decided to circulate it to several hundred of the stakeholders who might be involved in gender issues. Went to academic groups, groups working on women and science throughout the world. But I also made sure that it went to policymakers in both developed and developing countries. And I asked them to be brutally frank about what they thought about it. And we got basically two sets of responses. from the academic groups, most of them feminist groups, and they were bitterly disappointed with the report, they said. We had missed a golden opportunity to base our analysis on feminist theory and to come up with something really radical and something the world needed. The policymakers, almost to a person, said that this had gone way over the top in our recommendations. It was advocacy. You are being influenced, they said, by these women's pressure groups. You have gone well beyond the evidence which you presented in your report with your conclusions and recommendations. So the group got together again and said, well, who do we want to satisfy? The feminist groups in universities, and modified the report accordingly. Or do we really want policymakers to take some action as a result of our report? And we decided it had to be the latter. So we made sure that any recommendation we made was very clearly linked to the evidence. It was really evidence-based recommendations. But that was just something I leave you with, because there is, when you get a report like the Sussex Manifesto, there always is the potential for some form of conflict between analysis and advocacy. So thank you very much, Adrian.
Thanks very much, Geoff. Really fascinating to hear all of that. We have until, I think, Geoff, it's free until 2:30 to answer questions and to hopefully have some discussion amongst the people here. So if you can raise your hand if you have a question. You are also asked to identify yourselves for the camera. We're not going to be filming you, but we are recording today's event, so it would be useful to know who you are and where you come from. And if you have a question or a point that follows on directly from the preceding one, you can indicate that to me by raising both hands, so that we can have some continuity in the discussion. So, Melissa, first question.
Thanks, Geoff. That was really fascinating. I'd just like to probe you a little bit more on the story. And could you tell us a bit more about why your report was rejected as the introduction to the overall global statements, and perhaps how that related to some of the ways in which your messages and analysis might have departed from, as it were, the orthodoxies of the time? I mean, was that part of what was going on?
Can I that was Melissa Leach from the Institute of Development Studies.
Sorry.
I'm going to speculate on the answer, because we never did really find out.
Okay.
But when they said they'd moved up the discussion by 2 days because someone had to leave early, I did inquire as to who had left early. The person who had left early was not a member of the committee. He was the UNESCO observer. It was Dehemty, a great friend of Martin's. And we know, I mean, that he was totally opposed to economists being involved with science and technology policy. He had told me, when he knew that I was coming to Sussex to a unit headed by an economist, that meant that there could be no further relations between the Science Policy Division at UNESCO and this new university group in Sussex on science policy. Our report was heavily oriented towards the economics. It wasn't just a supply-side driven analysis of science and the build-up of the science and technology system. It was very much showing the need for economic demand and what the implications of that might be for changes to the economic system and the whole planning process in developing countries. My suspicion is that the real reason was that Dehemty thought that I know he was annoyed that the committee had come to Sussex rather than to UNESCO to prepare the introductory chapter. I think it was an objective of his to try and kill it and hope that he would then, and UNESCO would be asked to write it. In point of fact, that is not what happened. We were told that it was considered not really appropriate for this world plan of action. There was too much emphasis on the economics for that. The plan of action was how you can develop research, both in the north and the south, which would generate the knowledge, regardless of what use was made of the knowledge, in the south. So it was very hard for us to understand and accept, and that's my speculation on it. I've never had it really confirmed. But I think, and then the other dimension that I say was that the planners for the second development decade, again, were not oriented towards accepting the value of science and technology. It's maybe sounds as though it's a hobby horse of mine, but it's actually true. There was a meeting in that Trieste centre a few years ago when Abdus Salam was still alive, in which the title of the meeting was "The Greatest Barrier to the Successful Application of Science to Development Are the Economists." And that was after Abdus Salam's experience on the South Commission. Now, I think the world has changed somewhat, and I don't think it's quite as bad now. But at that time, it was a pretty tense relationship. And I'd mentioned the approach document, which was essentially a green paper for the preparation of a science and technology policy for India under Mrs. Gandhi. And the economists who had an approach document for economic planning and economic policy did their very best to sabotage the science planning document. They had found that it had been to some extent influenced, if not based, with the Sussex Manifesto. And in the Indian papers at the time, they had headlines on the front page. The Indian National Plan, copied directly from a UK report. You know, they just everything they could to sabotage it. But I don't want to dwell on that. I'm making too much of it.
Other questions for Geoff? Got two questions.
Ben Martin from Sprue. Well, following up on that last one, in your hindsight, you looked at things that you thought you'd done quite well at the time, but also, very honestly, things that you hadn't done, but which in the spirit of the time you might have done. Looking back on those, to what extent do you think that was because you were already aware of the constraints in which you were operating? Did you have some inkling that there might be this big set to when you came to present the report? And did you therefore steer clear of certain things deliberately? Or if not, why were these things, which you might have picked up but didn't, why were they left on one side?
Oh, that's a good question, Ben. Certainly, we had no inkling of what the reaction was going to be. It was a total surprise to us. So that can't be the explanation. We were deliberately trying to avoid it. I suspect it was because of the constitution of the group. I mean, it was Hans, it was Chris, it was Charles in particular, who were very much sort of deeply rooted in economics. I mean, Charles had a degree in physics as well, but he saw himself, I think, primarily as an economist. So it was based on the experiences which each of us had had, and they were more directed towards the economic side of things than the social environment. Now, we did reflect, as far as I can recall, we didn't mention health issues. That, I think, is a very big weakness. We did discuss environment a little bit, but nothing like we would if we were doing it today. But I think we could have done more because it was just before the Stockholm Conference. And so there was fairly wide public understanding of the environmental issues. So,
and you'd had Rachel Carson.
And we'd had Rachel Carson before that, that's right. We had. So I suppose, again, it ultimately comes down to the fact that it was a relatively short time period. It was not a major task for any one of us during, I think, the 6 months that went on. And so we fed into it what we knew and knew well.
Okay, I've got 4 questions waiting. So first one from the back.
I'm Dominic Love from Minus. Geoff, thank you very much for a really fascinating presentation. I was particularly interested in the point which you've emphasised quite strongly about this potential conflict between advocacy and analysis, and the way in which the people that you were trying to influence were using that as a reason to reject some of your recommendations because that was not your province, apparently. Nowadays, people are equally, if not much more concerned about the opposite problem, where experts are being called on by politicians to make policy prescriptions of various kinds, and there's a lot of concern about the legitimacy and the accountability of experts, whether they be economists or technocrats of various kinds, being called upon by politicians to come up with these policy prescriptions. So my question is, do you agree that that's changed? And if you agree, why? What is it exactly that's changed, and why do you think it's changed?
Well, I certainly think it has changed. If I look, I think it must have been about 1967 or 68, about 2 years after SPRU had been in existence. We convened a meeting of the people who were then in SPRU and the senior science technology policy makers, the chairman of the University Grants Committee, chairman of the research councils. We had a weekend conference in the Isle of Thorns, which was the University of Sussex's conference centre. And the idea was that we would explain what were the research issues we were working on and let them know the preliminary results. And we were hoping that we would learn from them what were the big science and technology policy issues that they saw as coming up over the next few years, so that we could consider whether or not this was something we wanted to research before they had become real policy issues. It wasn't a very successful conference. We were talking at cross purposes, and then towards the end, the person who was then chairman of the University Grants Committee, Dainton, who you will remember then, and he said, I've suddenly realized that we've been talking at cross purposes. That you seem to think, you in SPRU, that the research which you do is likely to have some impact on policy. He said, I've only just realized that's what your thinking is. And he said, I can assure you, none of you will ever have any impact on policy. He said, policy is politics. It's horse trading. And let me tell you how I spent last week as chairman of the University Grants Committee. And he said, no matter how erudite your reports on, say, science education might have been, there would have been no use to me at all. So he said, I defend to the hilt the right of Sussex University to set up a group which looks at science and society issues. Glad you're doing it, but don't think you're going to impact policy. Now, 25 years later, when we had our 25th anniversary, there was in the Royal Society a debate arranged around to celebrate SPRU's 25th birthday. And the debate, well, they asked me to come up with a sexy title for it, but what I came up with, academic science and science and technology policy research, an academic luxury or essential ingredient of policy making. And they had some of the chief scientists who took one position, the position that it was a luxury, and you had Keith and myself debating as the proposer and seconder, that it was an essential ingredient, and Dainton was in the audience. So I think it has changed. I mean, I think now the fact that people are looking for evidence-based policy is quite a transformation for what it was when we did this work. But I'd like to hear the other questions, so I could.
Thanks.
Gordon McHerron from Sprue. Geoff, again, thank you very much for a very fascinating account. I was around at some of that time, but I learned a lot that was new. One of the things that really interests me that is a persistent trend, and I was very interested to hear you talking about it, it was the implicit results for science and technology and science and technology policy of policy making in quite other domains. I'll just give you an example from the last 2 days. I've been at a workshop in Oxford looking at innovation policy for low carbon futures in the United Kingdom. It's very hard to get the representatives of government to think about issues of how generic things like liberalisation and privatisation and more specific market-based policy instruments have enormous unintended, often random consequences for how technology develops. And they continuously wanted us to focus down onto a very narrow domain of something that was clearly badged explicitly as innovation policy, while colloquially throwing out a lot of the baby with the bathwater. So the issue has not gone away, but I'd be very interested to hear if you could say more about what you at times, as far as you can recollect it, said about the implicit effects on science and technology of economic and fiscal policy that you then saw.
Well, this was, I mean, that didn't come up explicitly in our Sussex Manifesto, but a few years later there was the Science Technology Policy Instruments project, which IDRC was funding. It involved 10 different developing countries from Korea and India and quite a lot of the Latin American countries. And they did delve into detail. I mean, their starting point was, look, we've invested a lot of money in science and scientific research. Initially, it was a purely Latin American project, so it was the Latin Americans who were saying this. And in fact, it was Carlos Áñez, who you may remember when he was Secretary General of the Venezuelan Research Council, said at an international meeting of the OAS in Lima that, you know, we have, over the last 5 years in Venezuela, invested a lot of money in research. And we now have more research scientists, we have more scientific publications, and the scientists are very happy. But if you were to ask me how any of that investment has improved the quality of life of poor people in Venezuela, I would have to say it was zero. That then led to a discussion and a widening of the group to include the Koreans and the Indians, to try and see why is this the case? What policy instruments are available that can effectively help a country implement its science and technology policies? And it was a 2 to 3 year project, involved 200 researchers throughout the developing world. And that was one of the things that they came up with. One of the reasons we're not able to influence through our explicit science and technology policies is because what's affecting the decision makers, particularly decision makers in enterprises, is not the explicit policy, it's what's inherent in, you know, fiscal policies. I mean, the clear-cut case was tax incentives.
Okay.
Great, thanks very much. I wish you'd mentioned earlier this Dainton's. Oh, I'm Andy Sterling from Sprue. Dainton's words of wisdom, because it could have saved a lot of tears. You mentioned the kind of critical reception you got from institutional vested interests, and also the science hardcore. I just wondered if you can recollect anything about other critical perspectives from the more critical technology views. I mean, well, you know, we mentioned Rachel Carson in the sense of environmentalism, but there was also increasing, Jacques Ellul, and there was Schumacher hadn't yet published his book, but was active. Theodore Roszak, I think, if I remember right, was writing through the 60s on those sort of critical technology, not just small is beautiful, but appropriate alternative technology was starting. And one might have thought that an initiative like this, with the normative agenda that you had, would have attracted attention, but then been itself, whether applauded partly or criticised. Do you remember anything about that? I know you later came on with the Meadows and the whole Club of Rome thing, that's later, but Was anything happening
No.
at that stage?
Well, in the Sussex Manifesto itself, there is a fair amount, a paragraph or so, a fair amount, addressing explicitly the case of the development of technologies according to the available factors of production, the employment issues, and they don't specifically remark about Schumacher, but we were certainly all very familiar with it. And in fact, I mentioned we had got the funding for what was to initially be a joint SPRU IDS project on scientific instruments in India. And we had appointed George McRoby to head that project. But it took ODA something like 6 months before saying they would give us the money and it's actually arriving. And in that time, George had been invited by Schumacher to set up ITDG. And so he went to ITDG and we got Norman Clark instead. And Norman worked on the project. So I think the report, if you read it carefully, will see that we were aware of the fact that technologies developed for the North, I mean, we make quite a big thing of this, aren't necessarily going to be appropriate for just transferring to the South. And that there is a need to develop new technologies, new types of technologies, which are more relevant to the factors of production.
So, if I remember, for me, it was then taken up as a part of that agenda then by that constituency.
No, I don't think there was much connection between our report and what Schumacher was doing. I mean, they were in parallel. But you know, I'm trying to think how that constituency might have worked. But I think our report was really quite clear about it, that there's a dimension here which has to be considered. Just what's developed in the North isn't necessarily always appropriate.
I'm Hubert Schmitz here from IDS. As you mentioned at the end of your talk, Geoff, the world is a very different place today. There's substantially more innovation activity, or let's say R&D activity, going on in what we used to call the third world. Nevertheless, the Sussex Manifesto remains an important reference point, including for our students. When we talk about, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but when we talk about the global distribution of innovation activity, we need a reference point in history, to compare the achievements of today with what went on before. And the one thing we keep falling back on is the Sussex Manifesto. And most students have no idea what's in the Sussex Manifesto, but they know one thing, namely that around in the early 1970s or late 1960s, developing countries accounted for something like 2% of global R&D.
Yes.
How was this figure arrived at?
Charles scooped it up.
Packs of envelopes were involved.
Yeah, he got the statistics of R&D spending in the OECD countries. That was fairly easy. We couldn't get any statistics for Eastern Europe, so we always did make out that this 98% was not 98% of total world expenditure. It was total world expenditure excluding what was in the Eastern Bloc. And then we used UNESCO statistics and statistics for the Pan-American Union, for Latin America and for other developing countries. So how accurate those statistics were, though, is another matter. But there were some statistics in official publications which we were able to aggregate and hence come up with that number. It wasn't just plucked out of thin air.
I'm Aisha Shah. I'm also the member of the STEP Center and I'm a research fellow at IDS. Thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation. I'm particularly very thrilled about the connection you made between the Sussex Manifesto and the 5-year plan in India and its science and technology policy. And I'm very determined to go into the bottom of that story. So thanks so much. But my question is not about that. Just kind of historically speaking, because you gave a very fantastic vantage point to sort of proceed looking at the history. And to start from the contemporary position, the latest UN report on the Task Force on Science, Technology and Innovation, this report calls it innovation and not development. It's very interesting that in the preface, actually, they mention they kind of quote Benedict Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher. And I quote Benedict speaking, "I do not know how to teach philosophy without disturbing the established religion." It's very interesting that the UN task force actually poses itself as kind of radical, a kind of a heretic from the previous positions. But then, looking at the whole history of the UN successive reports on science, technology and development, beginning with the 63 report, this was the conference which was called the Application of Science Technology for the Benefits of the Developed Countries. And then the next one happened in 1979 in Vienna. And then the 80s and 90s got kind of messed up because of the whole environmental point that started to emerge on the arena. But 2000 has once again come back to the science, technology and innovation, not development now. The point I want to sort of ask you is that, the way I look at it is that progressively the UN reports and conferences have kind of made science and technology-led development as a demigod. I'm not sure whether they have actually created successively different paradigms or radicals. Your report was very radical in terms of suggesting something very different, although following also the science technology-led development line. Now at that time, and I don't exactly remember when this happened, but sometimes in the 70s, there was a critical approach that emerged from Nordic countries called social control approach. And this was a very marginal approach. They argued that the reason for the maldistribution of benefits, and particularly under development, is not the lack of equal distribution of science and technology, but the fundamental social political reasons. And they actually advocated fundamental criticism of the social and political practices in a range of countries, both including developing countries and developed countries, in order to address this question of underdevelopment. I wonder whether you came across anything on this, or whether you had engaged with them, or any reflection on this.
But what was the group again that you're referring to?
It's the Nordic countries actually.
Oh,
in the UN debates, particularly the successive conferences that UN organized on science, technology and development. I'm not sure exactly where this happened, but I suspect it was more in the Vienna conference that the Nordic countries, this was in 1979, that the Nordic countries came up with this social control approach.
No, I'm not directly aware about that. I'm familiar with all of the UN conferences. I was at the first one in '63 as the delegate from Hong Kong. And that was what turned my career around from being a geophysicist to being interested in this whole field. And at that time, as you have read all the reports from that conference, you read any report from it, you'll know it was mainly referred to as a supermarket where the technologies available in the world were on display, and the developing countries were advised to go into the market, but with limited resources, and pick and choose the wares carefully. But it was on the hypothesis that the knowledge was already there. It was a question of what could you afford to buy from what was available. Then the '79 conference, that was different again because it was a governmental meeting, and its objective was to try and get more money out of the north for science in the south. And it didn't work. There were promises made, but they were never honoured. And but again, the main focus then, and that was interesting, it was about 10 years behind what we had published. What we had published and what the advisory committee in 1970 totally accepted was a very high priority is in developing indigenous scientific and technical capabilities. It took 10 years, it took until the '79 conference before that then became the rallying call for the '77, and the discussions in Vienna were very much around building not they call it endogenous, but rather than indigenous. But that was it. And this debate involving the Nordic position, as you say, I don't recall it influencing very much what happened in Vienna. It'd be interesting. I'd like to perhaps talk with you some more about it and learn more about what you're doing, but also definitely talk to you about the approach document.
I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Martin Bell from Sprue. Geoff, two things. One, I'd like to add a little footnote to your discussion with Gordon about
Yes.
implicit policies. I mean, I thought Gordon was sort of asking, like, for what, for instance, were the kinds of policies that had this negative effect. And if I remember rightly, from the work on this, it was things like the import substituting protectionist policy and the way it created a particularly non-competitive environment and the implications of all of that on the innovative behaviour of firms and how that impinged on the whole process. It was things like the implementation of public ownership policies, the implementation of the kind of curious way of implementing investment promotion behind protection barriers, where frequently, in order to sort of respond to the non-competitive situation created by protection, the common policy practice was then to fragment production in particular industries between 6 producers of toothpaste and hope that that had created something competitive. All it had done was created a kind of oligopolistic situation of massively subcritical scale producers that could never deal with innovative activity. And it was those kinds of issues that were being pulled out by the study that Geoff was mentioning. But my question to you, Geoff, was really about your balance. About one item in your list of did well and might have done better. And you put in the did well list something to the effect about we recognise that the supply side is more than R&D, it includes STS, i.e. science and technology services, other non-R&D but
Right.
scientific, technological, and even though you didn't say it, innovative
Yes.
activities or innovation contributing activities. I actually wonder whether that should be in your shortcomings, might have done better list. Because actually what you did in that report was almost exactly the same as every other report in this field has done for the last 30 years since you did that, or 35 or whatever it is. You mentioned it, you danced around it, you said, oh well, yes, there's more than R&D, there's other things going on, and then you spent the rest of the report focusing on R&D. And your targets were R&D, your discussion was R&D, the proportions of this and that, whether it was, it was all centred on R&D. And if I can trace a story of 30 years that has done the same thing, you can turn up with the African Union Pan-Africa Science and Technology and Innovation Policy Statement of 2 years ago, was it? It is entirely still about R&D. There is nothing about design, nothing about engineering, nothing about anything else, and the targets are about all African countries. And this is not just for science and technology, they've added innovation onto the title. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
But what is it about? It's R&D, and now we should go to 1%. And so, in effect, you didn't contribute really a challenge that to that prevailing dominant focus on R&D as the centre of science, technology and innovation policy. And yeah, would you agree?
Well, 2 weeks ago, Martin, there was a conference, a symposium in UNESCO in Paris, which I attended, I was invited. And it was comparing the R&D outputs of 52 developing countries. And the whole thing was totally oriented towards the R&D. Now, I made what would almost have been the identical comments you've just made to me, to them in public in Paris, saying that this was neglecting. I said I was taken back to a meeting I was at in Lima in 1972, where it was entirely on R&D, and what has happened, only more jobs for the boys. So, I mean, I totally agree with you that this other aspect needs to be stressed. Did we stress it enough in our report? I'm not sure. I wouldn't find it in a hurry, but I know somewhere in that report we say there are 4 elements, and we do say quite explicitly 2 things. One is that the focus on R&D is primarily because it's something you can easily measure. So people are comfortable talking about R&D because you can measure it. On the STS, we say we had been unable to find real statistics which enable us to say anything very concrete about STS, except that we make the point that whereas we more narrowly defined STS in more the Frascati way, and included geological surveys and all of those sorts of things. But we also added as a separate item, and there's a separate short paragraph on the engineering design work and so on, and another separate paragraph on the education side. And we point out that UNESCO incorporates both of those 2 dimensions in its STS statistics. And we say we don't know, we have no way of measuring how much should go on this broader definition of STS as compared with goes on research. But our guess is that it should be several times what goes on to R&D. But we didn't feel we could go any more because we didn't have...
Can I come back?
Come back.
I take all that, yeah, and it was an obscure issue and so on. But nonetheless, what's the takeaway message that a policymaker will come from this? The half page of little footnotes and qualifications, or the whatever it is, 2%, the R&D numbers. They'll take away the R&D numbers exactly the same way as the president of the World Bank at their big jamboree last year.
Yeah, last February.
Al Watkins set it up. We must talk about science, technology, innovation, and he drew pyramids from reports that we produced and all sorts of stuff. And when the bank president finished talking, he was talking about scientific research.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the takeaway number, that's the takeaway message. What might you have done? You could have made a really strong case for the collection of, it's not difficult to collect this other data, it's just people haven't been interested in doing it. It's just as easy to collect a lot of this other data as it is to collect R&D data. It's just there has been no significant effort until perhaps the Oslo manual stuff and so on, to address these non-R&D dimensions of, quotes, the supply side. You might have driven that harder and asked for the data to be produced as a matter of priority.
No, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, hindsight.
All right, maybe I'll move it halfway to the between the two lists. How about that?
I don't mind.
Ian Schoon's IDS. And this follows on from Martin's point. The report, if you read it, does make a very strong case for R&D plus. It also makes a very strong case to balance what you argued for was a refocusing on demand, indigenous demand. I mean, it was in 1970s language, but it was very much about demand. But it strikes me that actually, rather same point as Martin, because it ended up in this sort of UN version of targets and figures and numbers, and the only bit that we remember and teach to our students, so that is that, it seems, that the bigger argument about shifting from a focus, extending the focus of supply beyond R&D to these other aspects and shifting the focus from supply to demand has got lost. And having read the text of it, that was the big thing that came out to me. Wow, here was a very strong argument being made at that time for a refocusing of S&T effort towards a demand-orientated approach.
Yeah.
Look at the debate now, coming to the present, virtually all, and it's driven again by the availability of data, virtually all, and targets, and Calestis Juma was part of the African Union exercise that, indeed, a Sprue progeny, very much part of the lineage we've been talking about. But we're being driven again and again by these numbers. So, every talk that you go to about innovation in the contemporary world shows big numbers for India, even bigger numbers for China, etc., etc. Where is the debate about demand? And I think that in terms of the reflection on 40 years ago, and it really is very nearly 40 years ago, is one that I take from rereading that report.
Yes, very good.
There is a bit of time for one or two other questions if there are any. Okay, we've got two immediately.
I don't need to repeat again why I'm doing it. We haven't talked at all about multinational companies. And if one is into policy relevant work, ownership does matter. And even if one is not into policy relevant research, if one wants to explain the global redistribution of innovation activities, much of it is accounted for not by China or India, but it's about the multinationals that have settled in these countries, often very much to source the local knowledge rather than for any other reasons. Were these sorts of things on the horizon, or were these sorts of things discussed at the time? The whole question of where let's just limit ourselves to your agenda rather than the Bell agenda, where R&D activities take place.
Certainly, well, I think, I wouldn't say there was no, but there was virtually no investments in R&D by multinationals in the developing countries themselves. There was some, SDS type activities going on to benefit the multinationals. But it was only, 94, only 12 years ago, or whatever it is, that we did this study in China of which included the evidence for the development of R&D labs on a fairly large scale by some of the major multinationals. At that time, 12, 13 years ago, there were 7 corporations that were building their own R&D labs, hiring Chinese at more or less 10 times the local salary, which was still only 1/10 of the international salary. So they were able to get the cream of the crop of Chinese researchers working in those labs. And I was part of a team advising the Minister of Science and Technology whether this was a good thing for China or whether there should be policies to discourage. Because if the best scientists are going working for the multinationals, what might happen? But we eventually came to the view that at that scale it was probably all right, because there'd be some leakage and scientists would go out with the experiences of working for a large foreign corporation. I now gather that there are over 700 research laboratories of foreign corporations in China. And that I think this must be beginning to be a source of worry for the Chinese government. But it was simply not on the horizon at all when we produced the report in 1969.
One last question.
I wondered if you could reflect upon the North-South relationship. Your report actually very strongly makes a political statement about how the advanced countries need to invest in developing the R&D and other science and technology capabilities in the developing countries. taking on from there, because India has consistently argued this position in the last 3-4 decades, which now it has actually slowly sort of given up. In the UN task force, the 2000 report, the science and technology and innovation, they have removed the distinction between developed and developing countries. Now they are all talking about developing the global capacity of innovation. And India has no problem with that particularly, but going back into the history, in 70s and 80s particularly, and what I read from the literature is that particularly 80s was the time when there was this conflicts happened, what was also named later as a new international economic order, in which the southern countries actually consistently argued for more support from the advanced countries, and advanced countries spoke about spaceship Earth, that we are all a global world and we all need to travel together. So I don't know whether you would like to a little bit reflect upon this nonsense.
No, it actually is a very interesting point, which comes right through to today, of whether there is something called development science, or whether there is an area of science which is particularly relevant to developing countries, where scientists in the north could make a contribution. And there is, in fact, I think it's still ongoing, a debate in this country about whether a new research council should be established, which would fund development science. And I think the main conclusion is of the working group, anyway, and what I've heard, is that no one can define, apart from some areas in agriculture and some in health areas, where there clearly could be a focus, and you can call this new research which will clearly benefit the South. And that instead of that, each of the research councils in this country are being encouraged to develop collaborative projects with scientists in the South, so that there can be some spin-off effect. But the definitional issue is a major one today. But you're quite right about what was happening in the...
So what would be your position if you have to write this Sussex Manifesto today about this North-South relationship?
Well, I think that I would focus on three things. One is agriculture, the other is health, and the other is poverty. And poverty might be an issue which isn't just poverty in the South, it can be poverty in the North. Quick answer.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks. We're out of time, but on behalf of the STEP Centre and also other colleagues from SPRU and from IDS, I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking Jackie.